Hello everyone and welcome back to the second part of the series on pragmatics. So in the last session we talked about deixis, dialectic expression, different types of context, and also where pragmatics stands in the study of language. Now we're going to continue with the notion of reference here. So reference is the act of the speaker using a linguistic form to enable someone to identify something. And it depends on the speaker's intention, that is to refer to something, and on the speaker's beliefs. So the listener can identify the speaker's intentions. For example, in the example, I'm reading Shakespeare. You're referring to Shakespeare, not as a person, but the works of Shakespeare. And we have different types of referring expressions. We can use proper nouns, like Austen, like Chomsky, like Shakespeare. And we can use them to refer not to the people themselves, but to their works, to their books, articles, or movies, or whatever. Definite noun phrases, the philosopher. Indefinite noun phrases are man, and also pronouns. But successful reference does not only depend on the speaker, but also on the listener. So we have to include the notion of inference, which denotes the process of decoding the pragmatic meaning of an utterance. And this is a very important notion, because in order to understand the meaning behind these utterances, the listener uses additional knowledge to make sense of what has not been explicitly said. So an inference then is additional information used by the listener to create a connection between what is said and what must be meant. Now in our example, I'm reading Chomsky. For instance, the listener has to operate with the inference if Chomsky is the name of the writer of a book, then Chomsky can be used to identify a copy of a book by Chomsky. Now, similar types of inferences are necessary to understand someone who says that Van Gogh is in the museum. You know his works or paintings are in the museum, not him. Or we saw, I don't know, Shakespeare in London, let's say. Or my friend is wearing Calvin Klein or Armani. But we have different types of reference. So when we speak or write, we often refer to things that were mentioned earlier, haven't been mentioned yet, or were mentioned in another context or at another time. So we have three different types of reference: Anaphora, Cataphora, and Exophora. An anaphoric reference occurs when a word or phrase refers to something mentioned earlier in the discourse. So when we are reading this example, Michael went to the bank. He was annoyed because it was closed. So when we get to this pronoun he, we usually start by asking ourselves who this he refers to. And since Michael has been introduced here, and this is the closest one and most relevant one, let's say, so we understand that he refers to Michael, and it refers not to a grocery store but the bank. This is the most relevant and closest one. Then we have Cataphora. Now if we are reading this text, let's say, although I phone her every day, we reach this part, her, but we don't still know who this her refers to because nothing has been mentioned here. So we wait and we know it's going to happen. So this kind of reference, when a word or phrase refers to something mentioned later in the discourse, is called a cataphoric reference. Now this is an example of my mom. So this her as a referring expression refers to a mom later. Then we have Exophora. So exa, well, is a prefix for out of, right? Outside. Then when an exophoric reference happened, a word or phrase refers to something outside the conversation, the text, the discourse. Now, for example, here, he's late again. We don't know who he refers to because when we go forward and forward and forward, we still don't have any person that this he refers to. And also it doesn't refer to anything inside this text. It might refer to tea, coffee, dinner, weather, whatever. We don't know that. So we can only know this based on the context. That is, well, most probably the physical context. So this is an example of an exophoric expression. Another important issue to understand this intention of the speakers is the notion of presupposition. Now, let's take a look at these two examples first, and then I will give a definition of what presupposition is. So he's late again, and John stopped crying at noon. He's late again. This again makes us realize this presupposition that he has been late over and over, let's say, or he was late yesterday, or he was late 2 weeks ago or something. So this presupposes that he has been late before. Or this one, John stopped crying at noon. So it only makes sense if it is assumed that John was crying just before noon. If I say this to you and you know that John had not been crying at all, you would feel that what I say is out of place or that should be misled. So we say that the sentence John stopped crying at noon presupposes that John was crying just before noon. So many words, phrases, and structures create presuppositions. Actually, people do, but let's say through these words. So here are more examples followed by their presuppositions. The king of the Netherlands is very kind. So this sentence presupposes that the Netherlands has a king. Even if I negate this proposition, that is, I make this sentence negative, like the king of Netherlands is not very kind, it still remains the same, the presupposition. This is called constancy under negation. This is one of the ways that you can tell what presuppositions there are in a sentence. So next one, it is Bob who stole the chocolate. Well, it presupposes that somebody stole the chocolate, even if it's not Bob. So that's a presupposition. And then in a more general way, we design our linguistic messages on the basis of large-scale assumptions about what our listeners already know. Some of these assumptions may be mistaken, of course, but mostly they're appropriate. So what a speaker assumes is true or known by a listener can be described as a presupposition. And usually in television shows about lawyers and detectives, let's say, presupposition is often turned to the benefit of a crafty investigator. Suppose a detective suspects John of committing a murder in Amsterdam, but has no clear evidence that John has traveled there. The detective might casually ask, "Hey, John, tell us, how was your trip to Amsterdam?" So this sentence presupposes that John has been there, and so any answer at all will provide the crucial evidence that John has recently been to Amsterdam. Or a question like, "Why didn't you stop when you hit the deer?" It presupposes that, first of all, you hit the deer, and second of all, you didn't stop. So this brings us to the next topic, which is Grice and meaning. So the idea that meaning is based in the intentions of speakers is most clearly revealed in Grice's theory of conversational implicature. Very often, when someone says something, they don't mean exactly what the words literally mean. That is, the speaker's meaning differs from the semantic or literal meaning. For example, the semantic meaning of this example here, there is a bear, sneak up behind you, doesn't involve the concept of warning. It just reports a fact. However, it's quite likely that a warning is part of the speaker's meaning. This extra meaning, which goes beyond what the words literally say, is an implicature of the sentence. So Grice explained how speaker's meaning can be determined in such cases like this by positing a cooperative principle that all speakers and hearers assume when speaking to each other. Now, cooperative principle says that a speaker's meaning can be determined or calculated on the basis of semantic meaning and the assumption that speakers are behaving rationally and cooperatively. So Grice broke this general principle down into 4 conversational maxims to explain what rationality and cooperativeness are. So the maxim of quality says that make your contribution one that is true rather than false, that is, be truthful and honest. Maxim of quantity says that provide the information that is required for the purposes of the conversation, but no more, that is, be concise. And maxim of relevance says that make your contributions relevant. And lastly, the maxim of manner says that be clear and orderly in your talk, that is, avoid ambiguity. So these maxims are not rules to be followed in the sense that traffic laws are. Rather, they are assumptions which we use to try to make sense of what people say. That is why we assume that people follow these 4 maxims when they talk, and this helps us figure out what they mean. So consider these examples here. Let's imagine that there are 3 students in the class, Mary, Bob, and Jill. And A asks which students passed the exam, and B replies, Mary and Bob. So in this conversation, in addition to concluding that Mary and Bob passed the exam, A is likely to infer that Jill didn't. However, B never said that Jill didn't pass the exam, so why would A infer this? By assuming that B is following the 4 maxims, A can figure that B gave as much true information as was required and relevant, maxims of quality, quantity, and relevance. Since it would be relevant to say that Jill passed if she actually had passed, A can infer that B didn't include Jill in the list of those people who passed because B doesn't think that Jill actually passed the exam. So in the end, this becomes the meaning, the part of the meaning that A wants B to understand. Now, another example of implicature is this one. Elvis Presley made a peanut butter sandwich and sat down beside the pool. So this sentence seems to mean that Elvis made a peanut butter sandwich before going to the pool. This before meaning is not part of the semantic meaning of and, right? So it is an implicature. According to Grice's maxim of manner, we should present information in an orderly way. And in most cases, that includes mentioning events in the order in which they occurred. So a listener here can conclude that the speaker means to say that Elvis made the sandwich before sitting down by the pool. But these Gricean maxims, I said, are not rigid rules, like rules of law. Rather, they're flexible assumptions about how speakers behave. So they can be broken, violated, or flouted to implicate further meanings. Now, flouting a maxim occurs when a speaker uses language in a way which appears, in an obvious way, to violate a maxim. For example, if you ask me whether I think your new shirt is beautiful, and I say, it was probably inexpensive, my reply seems to violate the maxim of relevance. I didn't answer your question, but because you assume that despite appearances, I am conforming to relevance, that is, I'm being cooperative, you try to figure out how what I said could be relevant. Since my utterance avoided answering your question by mentioning a reason why you might have bought an ugly shirt, you will infer that I don't like the shirt. So this inference can become an implicature of the sentence, that is part of my speaker's meaning. Next section, we're going to talk about speech act theory. But before that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please do. It means a lot to me and helps me keep providing more material. Stay tuned, please.